Today is Saturday, October 9th. The year is 2021. This is No Easy Answers, and I am your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. Well, thank you for tuning in from wherever you happen to be listening. My name is Jules Taylor. This is No Easy Answers, and I am delighted to have you with us for today's episode. No Easy Answers is a podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition, and we are 100% listener supported. So if you want to support the show, join us over on our Patreon. That's patreon.com/noeasyanswers, where you can unlock lots of cool bonus content, including the video for some of our episodes, including this one. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on your podcast host so that you never miss an episode, and leave us a 5-star review in Audible and Apple Podcasts. Follow us on social media. We've set up a number of ways that you can interact with the show. You can reach out to us on Discord, Twitter, you can comment on our Reddit page or in the YouTube comments. Today's episode is it's the final episode in our ongoing collaboration with the guys over at the Acid Horizon podcast. I'll be speaking with Adam Jones. He's a doctoral researcher focusing on the link between the work of Hegel and the work of Max Stirner. So I'm going to keep this intro short today because I'm actually in Texas visiting family, and I'm actually recording this intro on my cell phone. But I'll be back in New York soon, and I know it's been a couple weeks since we've published an episode, as I've been I've been dealing with family stuff down here in Texas, but I do have some interviews planned for when I return, as well as some new bonus content. In the meantime, I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Adam about Max Stirner and Hegel, and check out the Acid Horizon podcast. Follow those guys on social media. Those guys are doing great work, and I'm really thankful to all the hosts of Acid Horizon, Craig, Will, Adam, and Matt, for collaborating with me to make these episodes happen. So here's my conversation with Adam Jones on the work of Hegel and Max Stirner.
Hello everybody, my name's Adam. I'm from the podcast Acid Horizon, but I'm also a doctoral researcher at CMEP in London, so mainly focusing on the link between Hegel and the work of Max Stirner and how that relates to certain contemporary leftisms, left-egalism, etc. today. I also do a lot of jungle music, a bit of harsh noise here and there over at the coming insurrection.
I will tell you that I was like, let me, Adam's a musician. Let me check out some of his stuff. Maybe we'll play some of his music as the outro stuff. And I had my headphones on. I was not quite expecting this blast of digital distortion and stuff like that. So yeah, a little noise rocky, but it's super cool stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah. The Hegelianism of all this stuff though, man, I saw this meme the other day that was tell me the truth even though I don't want to hear it. And, it had Kirsten Dunst crying or something. And then somebody says, eventually you must read Hegel. And so Hegel is someone that I've also avoided, man. We were just talking off camera about how Stirner, who we're talking about today, is someone who I've maybe ignored because there are some, as a sort of collectivist mindset, as a Marxist, as all these different things. Stirner has this hardcore individualism that is maybe not necessarily antagonistic, but it is something that is that has some tension there. But before we get to Stirner, I have to ask you about Hegel, man. Was Hegel, because I honestly don't know a whole lot about Hegel, but I know that as I've been listening to a few podcasts lately talking about Hegel, and was Hegel's project to basically explain all of human epistemology, to provide some sort of theory for everything sort of thing? Do I understand that correctly?
In a sense, yes. He's trying to explain how thought develops and how thought develops. Let's try this again. Fundamentally, he doesn't see a split in a way that someone like Immanuel Kant will do between our thinking and the world. Rather, the very problems that our thinking gets into when it tries to grasp the world as it is in itself is actually part of how the world is structured and actually how it develops. So for Kant, we can't get into the end itself because every time we get there, we get into all these contradictions. You know?
Right.
We can't get into the heart of being because if we tried this, we get into all these contradictory positions. And Hegel's fundamental argument is, okay then, but what must being be like such that when we try to grasp it, we always get these contradictions in the first place? What does that say about being that we can't grasp it without contradictions? And he tries to transpose this method of knowing into the very object itself. The fundamental Hegelian point is kind of the way in which we fail to appraise the truth of the object is actually part of the object itself. For example, if we fail to grasp ourselves as this, pure, lovely I, the I of the I think, it's because the I in itself is actually something that's inherently split, in tension with itself, in contradiction with itself. And I think that's the fundamental point of Hegelianism. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to give an account of not only how thought develops from its most basic, from its very beginning, really, and to see how it develops across time, but also develop how time itself develops throughout its all kind of self-splitting. Because for him, the logic, so the science of logic, one of his most famous books, is a logic of ontology at the same time it's an ontology of being. He's trying to think at such a basic level at the very beginning of thought, such that the being of thought, the being and the thought are the same thing. So thinking through its development completely, imminently, without any presuppositions, anything being brought in from the inside to stabilize it, and seeing how that ends up. And the science of logic is this really sort of beautiful, but also very comic sort of drama of all of these concepts collapsing and taking over each other. It's Bertolt Brecht famously said it was a hilarious book to read. Then, of course, you have other aspects of Hegel's system, which is the philosophy of history, the philosophy of religion, and he tries to sort of comprehend how this logic plays out both historically and in terms of the history of our own, the ways in which humanity, and for Hegel, it is predominantly Eurocentric humanity, and this is a major problem with Hegel, is how it developed its own conceptions of itself, how it develops, how it represents itself as a creative power, and it does this through religion. And eventually, the problem with Hegel is that it all ends up with Hegel. He's the end of history here. I mean, this is actually not as much of a strong metaphysical claim as some people like to think, because the end of history for him just means, well, history ends whenever time you do a history. The end of history always ends with now. I mean, he's just fulfilling that historical process by writing about it. But yeah, Hegel has this. There's multiple Hegels. There's a Hegel for everyone. There's a Hegel for Marxists. There's a Hegel for accelerationists. There's a Hegel for Kantians. A Hegel for pragmatists. And for me, my work is there's a Hegel for Stirner. There's a Hegel for Stirnerians.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think let me ask you about because I know that if we start talking about Hegel, I think listeners will probably immediately gravitate towards like some thoughts about dialectics, thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
God, no.
Right. That's like the stereotypical Hegel thing, but it's much more than that. I think have been. I forget where I was reading this recently, but the thoughts of the dialectic manifesting in different things in that, like, particularly through like Neoplatonist stuff and Christianity, like the downfall of Lucifer was made into like a necessary thing. Like if you're going to create like the son, an anarcho sort of son of God, then you have to have a dialectically opposed force, which is the downfall of Lucifer. And so it was an interesting thought to me that like, that the fall of Lucifer was a necessity at that point. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or whatever. We're a little bit afield, but
Well, I mean, Hegel does have a point in the Phenomenology of Spirit, particularly the later parts of Absolute Knowledge, where he does talk about the unity of good and evil as being two aspects of the same event, which is the self-splitting of being, the contradiction, the heart of being ends up playing itself out in these ways. There's a it's a quote that Zizek likes to put out, which doesn't actually exist in Hegel, that does sum up an argument of a different part of the phenomenology, which is evil is in the eye which sees evil everywhere. If you think of like a witch hunt, where these witches exist, only in the eyes of the witch hunter, ultimately. Right. And you can sort of see this unity of good and evil in terms of the subjective and objective modes of it. It's a much more complex argument than I'm putting forward, but there is definitely, a fundamental motion of the dialectic in Hegel is unifying opposites. Right. So dialectical opposition on one level is, in one way, it purely just describes the opposition, like the opposition between a positive and negative pole of a magnet, for example. And that would be what, if you're talking about dialectics, that would be the part of the dialectic which Hegel would say is on the level of the understanding, because the understanding is this thing that puts things into oppositions, it makes splits.
Right.
But the part of that dialectic which would correspond to what Hegel calls reason is the unifying of these opposites. So when you understand that a magnet only has a negative pole insofar as it has a positive pole, these poles are interdependent. Which is why, of course, if you cut a magnet in half and it's still magnetically charged, you get two magnets. Because you cannot think of these identities in abstraction. They're not pure identities. They're codependent with their exact opposite. And if they have, if there's going to be a positive pole at all, if you cut a magnet in half, the positive pole falls one way, the negative pole falls another way, the positive pole will move to the other end of the magnet and then produce its opposite on the other side. So it's all about showing the inherent impurity or interdependence of identities that seem to be in opposition. And this opposition isn't completely gotten rid of. The positive pole isn't the negative pole, but the identity of each pole has a moment in which it needs that other pole that it seems contradictory to it.
I think it's remarkable that Hegel touched on this stuff as early as he did, because what you're talking about in terms of like binary oppositions and maybe univocity of the collapsing of these entities into a unification insofar as their identity is dependent on their opposite. That seems very post-structuralist to me. Whereas like this is way back when with Hegel. So I think it eventually I will have to read Hegel. I have not been so brave as to attempt that. I've been reading a little bit of Kant lately, Critique of Pure Reason. It's difficult stuff to read and to comprehend, and it requires a sort of sustained focus that So so all of that. Let's get to Stirner, man. Hegel is kind of remarkable to me that he was doing all this back when. But so there's a Hegel for everyone, as you said, and your Hegel's with Stirner. One quote I remember about Stirner when somebody was explaining Stirner was like, "Hey man, if the revolution's tomorrow and my role in that revolution is frying chicken at the KFC, then I don't want it." It comes down to this very individualist notion. So I'm wondering about Stirner, man. Can you maybe situate this guy in history and tell us about him for listeners who are not familiar with Max Stirner?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not simply that there's a Hegel for Stirnerians or people want to read into Stirner. Stirner went to Hegel's lectures. He was rare for a Guggian. He went to Hegel's lectures. He went to his lectures on, I think, religion and on the philosophy of spirit, so part 3 of his encyclopedia. And then he also took logic with a sort of right Hegelian follower at the time, a man called Karl Werder. And Karl Werder is interesting because his entire thing was focusing on the role of nothingness and the really stretching negativity in terms of how central it is to Hegelian logic. And Werder was actually quite an influential teacher because at the time, it wasn't just Stirner in Werder's class. It was quite a small class, but he also had Engels, Turgenev, where we get who gives us the term nihilism. His novel Fathers and Sons, the Russian author. So folks are so it's not just Stirner, it's Engels, Turgenev, Bakunin, and Kierkegaard. Yeah. So big heavy hitters, lot of nothing in this being transferred through Karl Werder here. And yeah, Stirner's born in 1806. Same year the Philology of Spirit comes out. Goes to Hegel's lectures. Becomes a school teacher at some point. Writes his first dissertation on school rules, which is a very un-Stirner kind of topic, which is quite funny. Then he ends up sort of floating around Berlin for a bit in this bar, Hippel's Weinstube, on Friedrichstrasse in Berlin. And he meets with all these guys who call themselves Die Freien, the free ones. So people like Arnold Ruge, Friedrich Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, Edgar Bauer, Moses Hess, people like that. And they just argue about Hegel for a few years, getting drunk and arguing about Hegel. Engels is quite smitten with Stirner at some point. They actually discussed Werder's work together. Marx was not around at this time, but he was editing certain journals that Stirner did publish in. So Marx and Stirner weren't always at each other's throats. Although Stirner never read the stuff Marx wrote about him, thank God. But he'd have died a lot earlier. But yeah, Stirner writes his most famous book, The Einzige und sein Eigentum, which many of us know today as the ego and its own. Bad translation. The Einzige is what's get translated as the ego, but there's very little ego, if any, in Stirner's book. No, egoism is a bit that is used, but it's mainly as a kind of pejorative because that's what everyone he's yelling at. So he's yelling at people in the pub in this book. And they all think egoism is bad, so what does he call this thing? He calls it egoism. So he writes this book, Die Einzige und sein Eigentum, which we can now translate as the unique and its property, which is a bad translation. And that makes a huge storm amongst these young Hegelians in the pub. Feuerbach, Sezeliger, Hess, they all write extensive critiques of Stirner. Actually, in one of the few collections we have of young Hegelian literature, about half of it is responding to Stirner.
Wow.
And he has a huge impact. He has a huge impact on Engels, who's his good friend. He drew that little picture we have of Stirner.
Oh, wow. Engels drew that?
Yeah, Engels drew all of them. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
He was asked
Holy
to draw
Christ.
it by a guy called John Mackay, who did the biography of Stirner. Literally the only biography we've ever had of any of these guys, unless you count Engels. But he writes this book, goes absolutely insane in the pub. He writes a response to it, and then essentially he does very little. He publishes an introduction to a collection of reactionary literature because he was analysing people who were responding after the fall of the 1848 revolutions in Germany and across Europe. He translates Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, so he had a similar affinity for Smith as Marx did. And then he sort of goes into debtor's prison and dies in obscurity in Berlin.
Wow.
Oh, so he also ran an anarchist milk shop for one point, but that's but apart from that, that was Max Stirner. In a minute, I don't know, 2 minutes.
Wow. So, yeah, I mean, I picked up a copy of The Ego and Its Own, or The Ego and His Own, or whatever. And the opening lines are kind of, it's interesting, like all to me is nothingness sort of thing, you know. It's interesting because, you know, he talks about things like, if I am not for myself, then who will be? And, you know, is God himself not for himself? And if God is not for himself or something, it's pretty wild stuff, but it is really, you know, intriguing thought. I wasn't completely turned off by it. But what you're telling me is really interesting about how like at one point, you know, within Hegel's lectures, there's like Bakunin, there's Kierkegaard, there's Engels, the dude that gave us the term nihilism. I mean, this is a really, you know, cool part of history. And obviously, like, this is all at the same time that Schopenhauer's probably delivering his lectures that nobody attended.
Yeah.
Really cool stuff, man. So, in doing a bit of research for this, I've found that Stirner is considered to be a forerunner to nihilism, existentialism, postmodernism, individual anarchism.
Yeah.
There are 4 things there, and I'm wondering if we could address each of them individually, maybe starting with nihilism and Stirner's influence on those elements.
Yeah, I mean, nihilism, insofar as his key categories are, you know, the unique, which can never be named or captured, the creative nothing. I think his influence on nihilism primarily comes about through the phrase you mentioned that begins and ends the book, unique in its property, which is in German, ich habe mein Sack auf nicht gestellt, which is it's actually I have set my affair on nothing. It's not so much all things and nothing to me that in terms of what my cause is, there's nothing fixing it. It comes from a German drinking song by Goethe, which is essentially about not taking life too seriously. It's very jovial. It's quite fun. I mean, and it's all about how eventually a man puts his faith in fame, and he puts his faith in glory. And then he's like, actually, no, I've lost my leg, I've lost my money, I've got nothing left to do. So I'm going to have a drink now, and I'm going to set my cause on nothing. So it's not as nihilistic as I think it comes about, but the English language reception of Stirner has definitely tempered this kind of reaction. Actually more engendered, if anything else, because the first full-length English text to come out on Stirner was called Nihilistic Egoist by a man called R.W.K. Patterson, and that really cemented the nihilistic conception of Stirner so far. So in terms of influence on nihilism, it both is and isn't there. But you can definitely see in this very negative rejection of moral categories that such a view would come about. Existentialism, I think he shares similar themes with Kierkegaard. So, for example, about the idea of uniqueness, of being unable to speak about one's faith in these general terms. I think Kierkegaard and Stirner both have very similar views on the general and what can be spoken of and not. There's a great essay by Martin Buber comparing the two, if anyone's interested. Individualist anarchism, he's probably one of the first. Sort of the man who spread the gospel of Stirner after his death, John Henry Mackay, big influence on individualist anarchism. He's had more influences than people would suspect. Post-structuralism, somewhat of an influence on post-structuralism, really. It's, Deleuze, in the book Nietzsche and Philosophy, cites Stirner as a reason to break with Hegel. He says that if Hegel produces this horrific thing, then it's obviously true that he says Stirner reveals the nihilism, the truth of Hegel's dialectic, which may or may not be true. I think I agree that Hegel does produce Stirner, but maybe not in the ways that Deleuze think about it. I think some of his most underrepresented influence, though, really has been in sort of a wider sort of a queer and LGBTQI plus literature. So the first ever, at least in Europe, sort of gay journal was called Der Eigener, which is originally started off, well, the owner, the property. Well, the owner. And it was in the 1930s, well, 20s to 30s, Weimar Germany publication, and it started based on Stirnerian philosophy. And he was also a big influence on some feminists like Dora Marsden, who started sort of the radical journal The Egoist. So Stirner's influence is more progressive than I think the sort of more edgy nihilistic stuff can go for. But it's also a wider question. I think the question of his influence on post-structuralism is also tied to the question of Nietzsche. The question of if he influences Nietzsche or not is sort of kind of central to that. There's also some other weirder parts. So there's rumours that Stirner is still taught in some Rudolf Steiner schools because he was a huge influence on the early Rudolf Steiner. But apart from that, I think they've exhausted everything.
You mean that like Stirner is maybe being taught in like the what's the Rudolf Steiner schools, the Waldorf or whatever? Right.
Yeah, I heard from a friend of mine that the essay he did on education, on the false principle of education, which is about rather than forcing people, trying to create students as like creatures, as fixed disciplinary units, you go off and do this, and I've taught you to do this and nothing more. It's all about cultivating creativity within the subject of education, making them creators and not creatures. And apparently that is taught. I should probably confirm that a bit more, but Stirner was very influential on Rudolf Steiner.
Do you, and this is a little off script, but do you know of any Stirner influence on like maybe Ayn Rand?
It's entirely possible in the same way that Nietzsche was influential on Ayn Rand. I have to admit, there must be a lot of literature that compares the two. Like I said, I haven't found any in English language really doing it. I think the conversation with Nietzsche and the right in terms of her sort of idea of an ego is good or greed is good kind of thing, I mean, it for me, it has such a fixed idea of the self and a fixed idea of good that would be totally incompatible with Stirner's project. I mean, Stirner may not be a moral thinker. He's definitely, in my view, an ethical thinker. We can get into that later. But I think a lot of the attempts to conflate Stirner with the right have not been based on very much. I mean, there's an edition I have of The Ego in its own. It's from an edition called Roots of the Right, a series. And in the introduction by John Carroll, he says, we don't really have much of a basis of putting this in here, but Mussolini read Stirner, so he liked it, so maybe. But I mean, Mussolini read Bordiga. We don't put him in fascist compilations.
Right. Yeah. I'd be curious if you could speak a little bit more about when you were speaking about his influence on nihilism. There is a bit of like a Stirnerian rejection of maybe conventionalist morality, and I wonder. On its face, that seems kind of like, why or how exactly is he coming to these rejections of morality?
So the extent to which he comes to a rejection of morality is primarily through a rejection of what he calls the spook, which is fundamentally the idea that there is an idea, an ideal, an abstraction which not only is to be served, but one which you are obligated to serve because it has a kind of different reality to your own, one that has claims upon you, and one to which you really have to serve. And his main problem, the spook isn't it's not a thing, it's a relation. It's a relation of heterogeneity, where essentially you act as if this idea, this ideal is something different from your own subjectivity, that it's an asubjective creation. It's like it's a substance, non-contradictory, perfect, existing on its own account, that has the authority, the unity, the actual power to force you to do things. And fundamentally, rejection of morality is rejection of the idea that, I should do this thing for someone else because it's... If I was to explain... Okay, let me start again, sorry. It's fundamentally the idea that we should do things for other people not because of some essence that is participating in them. For example, it's not saying, okay, why am I saving this person's life by pulling them up a burning building? It's because they have the sacred essence of humanity, and humanity is this little spark which I need to save, which happens to be in them, and that's what makes them special. No, I should save them because, well, I want to save them. It's not because they have this spectral, ghostly little figure hiding in them that I've got to save because that's this precious thing. And there's definitely a position here where we can get a kind of animal rights discourse out of Stirner. The idea that this human essence, this spectral identity that sits within them in their heart, that makes them great. And this makes them worth, not eating. Why am I not eating anyone else right now? Is it not? It's not because their pain gives me pain or their pleasure gives me pleasure. It's because they have this magic little ghost in their brain, which I must never trespass upon. And that's ontologically just doesn't work for Stirner. And I think you could definitely see this as part of the Hegelianism that sees contradiction at the heart of all things. It sees substance as subject, and fundamentally this heterogeneity doesn't work for Stirner because these things aren't things in themselves. They're things for me that I'm in relation to, and ontologically we're not all that different. So why would I treat this thing as if it was something sort of beyond me? The rejection of morality for Stirner is rejection of essentialism, at least in terms of how essences can be seen as rigid, prescriptive. I mean, he has a great rejection of the concept of gender normativity as well, where in Stirner's Critics, which is his response to people who respond to unique in its property. And at one point, Feuerbach says, well, isn't your brain masculine? Like, what can you do about that? Surely you're compelled to act masculine by your brain. He basically tells me to fuck off in no uncertain terms, really. This essence is some sort of spectral entity living in my brain, completely absurd. Ontologically just doesn't exist.
It's interesting you mentioned the anti-essentialism. Maybe this can bridge us over to our questions about Nietzsche, which are just simply like, asking about the extent of the influence on Stirner that Nietzsche had, but I think there's some tension between some fundamental Nietzschean ideas when you're talking about animal rights and like the spook of like the subject and object being one, and that like we're not differentiated from animals, and that there's a small little bit of us that makes us humanity that we can't trespass. There's a animal rights sort of discourse going on there. Whereas like there is this concept within Nietzsche that like, no, we're all like aristocrats. We're all Hyperboreans. We're all like, of this elite sort of, it's almost like anti-essentialism of Stirner versus like the aristocratic sort of essentialism of Nietzsche.
Yeah, there's definitely kind of, I mean, there's a sense in which for Nietzsche the self can sort of trespass itself, only insofar as it sees itself going to more heights of power. I think if an essence didn't work, if an essentialist conception didn't work for Nietzsche, he would sort of cast it aside. And the animal rights thing is more of a way of me explaining Stirner. I mean, in terms of how he talked about, so really the unity of subject and object for him happens in property. But property for him is the word Eigentum, which isn't so much of an abstract sort of catalyst, I own you, the state must defend this. Property is fundamentally about being an object for someone else and about how one relates to objectivity, how one relates to the ways in which oneself is expressed in the world, because one's subjectivity is expressed through how one orients oneself and how one treats objects. Eigentum is fundamentally is actually more of a spatial thing of how the self conducts itself in the objective world. So to take the word Eigentum, the tum, the tum, it's almost like it's a spatial thing. So sanctum, or if we say in English Christendom, the dom, it's like a domicile of the eigen, of the own, the space in which autonomy or being a self is practiced, rather than this simple, always devouring force. Everything is mine, mine, mine. Everything is an object for me, and I have a sort of orientation towards every object, but he's not simply saying everything is mine.
Okay. Yeah, that makes more sense. I think everybody after Nietzsche was answering Nietzsche in some sense, but I mean, is there like an alignment between Stirner and Nietzsche, or how does the influence of Nietzsche sort of? I think this is like a debated thing, like how much influence Stirner had from Nietzsche, but I don't think their ideas are in complete tension, really.
Well, I think it's more the other way around, really. I think because Stirner predates Nietzsche, but I do have some theories about whether he did or did not.
Oh, I'm sorry about yeah.
But in terms of who influenced who, I think there's a very good case that Nietzsche. So I'm doing it now. So that Nietzsche did in fact read Stirner.
right.
Because I mean, not only. So you have in The Use and Abuse of History for Life, that essay, Nietzsche's responding to a man called Hartmann and his book, The Philosophy of the Unconscious. And the part of the book of Hartmann's that Nietzsche is responding to, those parts actually are responses to Stirner in Hartmann's own work. So he would have known this. But also there's an amazing quote. Pardon me. There's the quote from this collection called The History of Materialism by Friedrich Lange, which Nietzsche absolutely loved. And I found this quote because there's a section in it on Stirner. And I'm just going to read it out because for me, if Nietzsche read this, he would have read Stirner. No doubt. So it says, Stirner went so far in his notorious work, Der Einzige und sein Eigentum, as to reject all moral ideas. Everything that in any way, whether it be external force, belief, or mere idea, places itself above the individual and his caprice, Stirner rejects as a hateful limitation of himself. For out of the unlimited ego, I can again beget every kind of idealism as my will and my idea. Stirner lays so much stress upon the will, in fact, that it appears as the root force of human nature. It may remind us with Schopenhauer. So you have this idea of like Stirner being this thinker of the will who destroys all morality with his powerful ego, and also he's just like Schopenhauer. I cannot believe Nietzsche would have read such a thing and not been tempted to go pick up a copy of this book, especially given he knew people and was conversing with people like Bruno Bauer, who were avid friends and defenders of the Stirnerian works. To me, it's not an open and shut case because Nietzsche never said, I have read Stirner today, but for me, it's incredibly close to the core.
Yeah, I that's kind of what on this podcast we've had some Nietzsche talks with Professor Ronald Biener out of the University of Toronto. I had him on the show because I basically was like falling asleep one night, and I'm like, let me find an audiobook. I'll listen to some Nietzsche as I pass out. And I basically started listening to The Antichrist, which is his autobiography, and it's late in his life. So like it said that his views are probably most salient within that text. And the first line I heard was like, he's like, let us look each other in the face. We are Hyperboreans. And that really like struck me as like, whoa, wait a second here. Cause like, the Hyperborean thing is like a Greek mythology thing that starts with there, but it was really appropriated by like basically racists and integrated into like this mythos of the Aryan race.
Yeah.
And so that one statement from Nietzsche was a little. I think it might be a little unassuming. Some people might not notice it, but as far as like finding why far right figures gravitate towards Nietzsche. That one, it didn't go unnoticed by me. So in these talks about Nietzsche, in evaluating whether we need to commence a more serious engagement with his writing, like a sort of a second viewing of it, in a way, because like we were mentioning there's a Hegel for everyone. I think there's a Nietzsche for everyone too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
there's like many different ways you to walk away from that. And whereas in the past I've walked away with like, oh, I need to transcend and become a more powerful version of myself, or I need to look at sort of conventionalist notions in a way of like a genealogy of morals sort of way to really get at the root of why these things are morals or where they came from. I mean, I've walked away from Nietzsche with different interpretations, but this one was particularly alarming. And so when I realized that Stirner could have been an influence on Nietzsche, that to me was really interesting in that there is a sort of, like when we had Craig on the show with The Stranger, Daniel Barker, as he goes by, he was saying that Nietzsche is really like a philosopher of friendship, in that you can read him and come away with like, maybe he's reading it within a sort of like a more comical, charitable reading of Nietzsche, But I say all of this because I think that as far as the individualism of Nietzsche, as far as like, his ethos of like overcoming things and stuff. I mean, there's some Stirnerian sort of strains within those contexts, and so so there is something there. And I did want to ask you about like how far, if Nietzsche had even engaged with that. There is some evidence towards that, but it's not cut and dry, and the jury's kind of still out as far as if Nietzsche did absorb any of Stirner's writings.
Yeah, I mean, there are some parts of Nietzsche's work that are just incredibly. They almost seem like the ripped page. Page to page from Stirner. So, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, there's a section of The Virtuous where the argument is that fundamentally everyone who's going after virtue for its own reward still wants a reward, and they still act on the condition of this reward. It's fundamentally a critique of Kant, but it really does remind me a lot of the distinction between Stirner of unconscious and conscious egoism. So it says fundamentally morality is always going to be self-gratifying, even if you have to mediate it with a full sense that you're doing it for something else. And really this goes back to Kant, because Kant eventually has to say, for morality to exist or to be possible, there has to be some practical postulates, one of which is the ultimate good, immortality, God, and freedom. And the chance that you eventually can be rewarded for this. And it's the idea that eventually it is just a delayed egoism further down the line, or delayed sense of self-gratification. So I think you can definitely see a lot of that in Nietzsche. I mean, there's a lot of stuff obviously Nietzsche comes up with his own accord. I mean, not going to get a theory of the eternal recurrence in Stirner, of course. I mean, there is a historical sense in Stirner somewhat, but it's more parodical. So for anyone who's read the Ego in its own, or the Unique in its property, as it's called now, there is definitely, in the first part of the book, a historical element with some very nasty racialized terminology and racialized history. But this doesn't excuse it at all. He is taking the piss out of the third part of Hegel's philosophy of mind, which he did attend in lecture form, which at the same time he tries to supersede Hegel, because he's working in this, amongst all these Kantian anthropologists, he's trying to give a history of man, its development. He does go through what he calls sort of natural categories of man and anthropology. And this includes some absolutely just horrific stuff on sort of racial science and geographic distribution of races. And Stirner does take that along the same progression. And of course, he's applying it to Germans to sort of take the piss out of them. And of course, he was also working at a time when he was being very much censored. So they changed the year in publication. Otto Wigans, the guy who actually published most of these books, most of them got out from the censors. Some of them did get seized. But Stirner's book was notoriously so absurd to as not be dangerous, according to the German censor. But in terms of the troubling potential racial aspects of Nietzsche, which are definitely there in a more explicit sense, in his, he loves the idea of breeding a certain kind of humanity. For example, the idea of a humanity that can cultivate a better ability of forgetting things that aren't useful to it, rather than silly things like colour or something. Quantity of melanin in someone's skin. But in terms of that sort of link to Stirner, it's definitely not really something I could see much of it. Stirner and Nietzsche both are critical of the idea of a self as a fixed kind of thing, especially in stuff like so the Twilight of the Idols. Nietzsche has a whole chapter on why the self is kind of an illusion. One of the interesting points of conference between Stirner and Nietzsche is they're actually quite fans of Christ. So Nietzsche writes the book The Antichrist. Nothing to do with it, man. It's all about, and it must be called the Anti-Paul. It's like Christ for Nietzsche is this Dionysian figure who takes suffering on the chin, in immense pain, and then just takes it, fully takes it on. Whereas St. Paul is the one who gives this stuff about the holy community, gives the laws for the church, starts correcting and codifying what Christian communities can do in his letters, the Corinthians, the Romans, etc. I mean, these are all letters that Paul is writing to say, if you stop being so fucking weird, please, guys. We're trying to codify a religion here. And fundamentally, I think that's the same for Stirner, because the only example concretely that Stirner gives of an insurrectionary is Christ. Christ for Stirner isn't a revolutionary who's trying to take over the Roman Empire, but rather he's trying to render the ways in which it arranges him just completely inoperative by doing his own thing. Ironically, Catholicism would go on to revolutionize the Roman Empire.
Wow. All right, so I think we kind of touched on what Stirner means by spook. But I'm wondering if you could maybe give us a solid definition for what Stirner is talking about when he speaks of spooks.
So the spook is fundamentally an essence, a fixed, abstract ideal of what an essential way to live is, that either the subject believes to have control over them, to have dictation of what they should do, or one that is imposed by a state ideology. Fundamentally, a spook is a relation between oneself and one's own social self-conception, where the sort of the principle of one's being, or principle in general, is something outside of oneself. Rather than autonomy, the spook is heteronomy. It's rule from the outside by something which you believe isn't of an ontologically higher register of being than yourself. It's literally in German spook, S-P-U-M-K, yeah.
Right. So, like morality for Stirner, is that a spook?
Morality is a spook. I mean, especially what one pursues is the good things do things because there's an essence of the good there. Not to say Stirner doesn't have an ethics. I mean, Stirner famously says, I could never. Stirner is a very soppy kind of thinker, ethically speaking, because I think the way he reorients the subject and object distinction along these Hegelian lines means that he sees his autonomy fundamentally as tied to the autonomy of everyone else. Really, I mean, he says he has fellow feeling, quote, with every human being. With every living being, really. He just doesn't want to. He doesn't want to be compelled to sort of love or serve human beings because they have this magical essence of humanity, but because they have these qualities that are properties. There's a pun here on property and properties, which are just so damn enjoyable. He might as well enjoy the ones who are enjoyable and love the ones who are lovable. He loves all of them. I mean, morality is only a spook insofar as it compels or arranges the moralized people whilst not really having any substance of its own. Or pretends to have substance and authority.
Huh. All right, so I wonder, as far as normalization of power is concerned within maybe post-structuralist thought is concerned. I mean, we just had Will Conway on the podcast, as you know, one of your colleagues at Acid Horizon. There's a quote here from it was taken from the Relevance of Max Stirner for Anarcho-Communists by Matty Thomas. He says, quote, anarchists who only wish to abolish the authority of the state and capital, but leave the authority of fixed ideas like morality, humanity, rights, or altruism intact only go halfway. For the egoist, these spooks can be even more vicious than more visible forms of authority. So, in terms of a spook being a fixed abstract idea, heteronomy that compels you to keep to behave in certain ways, the idea of a spook. I mean, I think there's some real links between power normalization to the Stirner concept of a spook. Could you maybe compare those things or talk a bit about power normalization towards this?
Yeah, I mean, the spook is fundamentally in its heteronymous relationship to the individual. There's a dual sense in which the spook is not only a force of subjectivation, a force of self-subjugation, or the subjugation of a self, or the creation of a self that ends up subjugating itself because it's grown up with all these ideas of morality, nobility, fatherland, travail, family, patrie, as the Vichy France sort of slogan was. It is fundamental. Stirner's theory, and I think Saul Newman, who's a founder of post-anarchism, or at least a great scholar of post-anarchism, who writes a lot on Stirner, has written quite a bit about this. So Stirner is not a thinker who wants to abolish power as such, but he wants us to acknowledge not only our complicity in the forms of power that give us these forms of subjectivation of a good German, a good moral being, a good Christian, for example. And we do find these things edifying because they do give us these senses of self-worth, but also to explain how power relates to our own self-conceptions when we see power as something that we don't have. Fundamentally, we have no role in power other than to carry out the wills of powers that we see as higher. And I think this does translate into Stirner's fundamental model of democracy, which is the union of egoists, or which is more like an egoist. The word is Genossenheit, which has always been translated as an egoist association or an egoist mutuality. And mutuality is a key concept of Stirner. But Genossenheit also can be translated as comradeship. It's a comradeship of egoists working towards a common goal. And if this goal's been reached, it's done. It's transitory. It's a transitory social unit. But it's not allowed to linger. Otherwise, it's no longer a union of egoists. It's no longer a union of active, willing, cooperation, mutuality. It's become something else. It's become what Stirner would call a society, which is society in German, Gesellschaft, comes from the root Saul, the hall. And society for Stirner is a space, it's a constructed space of power which holds the members in common. We are all in this space in common. We're held in common by the space. A union of egoists or a democracy or a comradeship It's fundamentally a space that's held in common by us in our active creation of it. And the form of life is living in construction of that space. And I think for me, I've been working on this a bit more recently, Stirner's idea of the union of egoists is at the root more, I think, democratic than what democracy is in many other ways we can think of it today. Because demos kratia, demos kratos, the Greek, people power. The problem is that the demos aspect of that becomes given a kind of a centralist quality in which things are done, in the name of the people, the trademark, we must do this. It's the people's court, the people's sick, the people's execution, the people's concentration camp, etc., etc. And there's no idea that the people could ever. It's never come to be. It's always already there, and it's never allowed to pass away because everything is always done in the service of the people. And if people cannot be contradicted, nor can it be contradictory. The contradictory elements of the people state have to be eliminated because they are counter-revolutionary, because they oppose the rule of the people, capital T, capital P kind of thing. And I think really it's not what I would call democracy in that sense. It's more like what I call demonomia. The rule of, nomos law, the law according to a representation of the people, an essential fixed conception of what the people is. I think for Stirner, you had this idea of democracy where it's the aggregation of powers. People unify together to multiply each other's power. And they multiply each other's power, not simply to be powerful, to be consumed by power, because power itself can be a spook. It can become an addiction, where one is, always going after this source of power, whereas really the power comes from oneself. Fundamentally, the expression of the union of egoists is the idea that people come together to multiply their own powers in a way that affirms their autonomy. It's an autonomous, beautiful space of living, which doesn't have to linger on longer than it has to.
Yeah, I now you get my spidey senses tingling a little bit here because, I've often thought about like the reconciliation of individualist notions and collectivist notions within a Marxist framing. Yeah. I've always thought of the reconciliation of those items falling somewhere as like, now the way that I've explained it is like that we would fight that everyone has a fair shot, an equal shot at existentialism, like these perennial questions of who am I, the more concerned with like the concept of beings and doings rather than havings, so I, as much as the radical individualist that Stirner is, this concept of the union of egoism as an aggregation of power and people joining together in order to multiply their power, that seems along the same lines of like, ultimately there is a collectivist strain running through some of the individualism of Stirner.
Yeah, I mean, I think the individualism of Stirner has been overplayed not only by the reception of Stirner, but also by him. It's a polemical book. He's doing it to piss off people in the pub who's been yelling at for the past couple of years. I mean, it's going to happen. And Stirner's relative to socialism, he's not talking to Marxian socialists. He's talking to people at Arnold Root. He's talking to people like, to some extent, Feuerbach and Moses Hess. He's actually quite an interesting figure in his own right, Hess. He becomes a very important figure in Labour Zionism later, but for the love of God, please not get into that. Stirner says that the workers have the most tremendous power in their hands. All it needs is for Labour to come free and the state is lost. Or he says in Stirner's critics, I have no problem with what he calls the socialism or socialists. I love everyone, no, socialists, just not the sacred socialists. So he doesn't want to replace, one stick with another. And I think this goes into the difference between, for Stirner is an insurrection and a revolution. The revolution not only always devours its children, but fundamentally it's a swapping out of one arrangement for another. Whereas the insurrection is the no longer letting oneself be arranged. I think it's probably what you could get with some people, like, for example, Harteneggery with constituent power versus Tikkun with destituent power kinds of thing. do we have to have a people state, or do we have to sort of detach from the state and make something that's sort of parasitic on it that eventually renders it so weak we can sort of knock it aside without having to take it over. And there's this inner tension within Leninism as well, in my view, because ultimately the state is to wither away. It starts off an insurrection, but the revolution itself, there's this tension between insurrection and revolution where it's not simply to create new arrangements, but to create new arrangements that, as they keep persisting and existing, undermine the very structure of arrangement itself. Because the state, which is the tool of arrangement, of social arrangement, eventually withers away. And you can definitely see this Stirnerian moment there. I mean, I'm a big fan of Jacob Blumenfeld's work on Stirner. Where he says that Stirner is a kind of first-person Marxism.
That's a really interesting way of placing it. Yeah, first-person Marxism.
Well, the proletarian is the one who is nothing but should be everything. And I'm like, well, that's Stirner's egoist. And if you read the German ideology, what does they say to Stirner? It says, we can do this better than you can.
Right. Was the no gods, no masters thing, was that a Stirnerian concept before it became like a meme?
I mean, I think that's from Bakunin, if it's a pamphlet Bakunin wrote.
Really?
But
Okay.
Bakunin, classmate of Stirner, according to Engels, Bakunin was quite influenced by Stirner, so who knows? I mean, Bakunin wouldn't have heard All Things Nothing to Me. He would have heard something, Ich habe mein Sarg auf nicht gestellt, which would have been kind of similar, as I've said before. But there would have been I definitely think there would have been a link for this. They all came out the same classroom.
Right. Okay. So, in talking about that quote by Matty Thomas, which is, abolish the authority of the state and capital, but leave the authority of fixed ideas. This is kind of, this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of the tension between communist-minded folks and anarchists. Anarchists believing we can go straight to having maybe like a no state kind of thing, whereas like Marxists and communists and MLMs would think that we'd have to have like a proletarian state that would eventually wither away. This might be too broad of a question, but I'm wondering if as far as Stirner's influence on individual anarchism, was he I guess within anarchism, there was always this concept possibly of just getting rid of the state, or was that something that maybe Stirner had helped get along, or did he introduce the idea of just getting rid of the state as far as the anarchist tradition is concerned?
It would have been a constant struggle for him, I guess. I mean, the question of Stirner within the anarchist tradition is actually one that's somewhat contested, even to this day. I mean, there was I think it was called Black Flame. They had a slight controversy with whether to include Stirner or not. And he's included in many histories, mainly because his influence, not because he never says the word anarchy, But he does say hierarchy. Right. So, I mean, I think there's a metaphysical anarchy in Stirner. This is just a bunch of very niche Hegelianism, which I could spend hours talking about, but would become very boring very quickly. But in terms of the reconciliation between communists and anarchists, I mean, a lot of communists would spot, especially Marxist, Leninist influenced, would say, look, we want the same goal. We think the state's going to wither away as well. I mean, but we want it to wither. We're not going to just cut its head off, kind of thing. And I am not particularly knowledgeable on classical anarchism. I came to Stirner through Hegelian metaphysics. Not really the other way around. I'm not particularly well versed in anarchist position. I'm quite interested in this sort of new field of sort of more metaphysical interest in anarchism. So one of my teachers, Catherine Malibu, who's been very influential in this kind of work. She's writing a book on anarchy. She's done a few talks about metaphysical anarchism. We interviewed her on this concept, Pressed Horizon. I mean, I think that there can be a unity for the two, especially when it comes to theories of constituent versus constituent power. So constituent power is the idea that there is a constituent, there are people that have the power to constitute a state, and people need to realize that power and then take it back and then make the state that's properly good for them. Absolutely atrocious idea, to my opinion. I don't think the people are as non-contradictory as they think they are. But you have constituent power, which is more of the idea that we should sort of show the fact that this representative model, this model of trying to manifest oneself fully in the state is never going to work. And if we free ourselves from that logic of representation and trying to constitute new states, new people states, we just need better people in there. We need people to be better represented. Right. Then we can try something new. And I think fundamentally in that latter part, you have people like Takun, Agamben, the Invisible Committee, but also people like Michael Otari, who in his recent book, There Is No Unhappy Revolution, speaks of constituent power, speaks of insurrection, speaks to all these sort of late anarchist or anarchist-adjacent thinkers, but it's mainly working on Lenin and about what sort of revolutionary would be there to perform this operation by which a state starts to wither away. And that is fundamentally, he contests it's more of a destituent power revolution than the constituent power revolution. It's more of a way of accelerating the withering away of the state, not by taking over the state, but by rendering various parts of it inoperative through revolutionary, or he calls it revolutionary, I would call it insurrectionary action, which I do not endorse to any extent. For anyone listening, I do not endorse insurrection at all. Do not send the troops after me. But disclaimer, do not do this. But I think there is definitely a point of reconciliation, but a lot of it is just because of a lot of communist organizations, and of course there's sometimes a podcast about left philosophy. It is a reading group. Most of these organizations are just organized reading groups, and there's only so much time in the day to read all this stuff, so you're going to find favorites. You're going to find people say, look, I don't have to read Stirner, I don't have to read Lenin, I don't have to read. It's not productive, and I think there's so much theory going around that it's hard to sort through the stuff. And it's hard to find a principle of sorting through it. But I mean, I think a lot of these discourses, there's not really much dialogue at all. I mean, it's hard to have dialogue, especially on sites like Twitter, for God's sake. I mean, it's just, I'm not going to endorse a popular frontism where every left party gets together as a common goal, because some left parties are for their absolute dangers. I mean, the party model might not even be the best. But I think can Stirner reconcile with Marx? Maybe not on all of Marx's own terms, but of course there are many Marxes. I mean, they said that they left, Marx and Engels said they left the German ideology to the rats and never published it. It's an okay work. I'm not a fan of it, but it's but there's productive work.
So how did speaking of like the Engels and Stirner link, I understand that Engels had very positive things to say about Stirner, and even recommended to Marx that he read some of Stirner's work. And then this ends up being this in the German ideology or whatever. There ends up being quite an extensive sort of critique, a very tongue-in-cheek sort of dunking on Stirner in a way later on. So I'm wondering if you could tell us how Stirner and Engels went from being friends and chummy and recommending to Marx all the way to where they ended up dunking on the guy.
Well, Stirner and Engels seem to be quite good friends. There's a poem that Engels wrote about those days back in the bar, and Stirner is portrayed as this. It says, Stirner is drinking beer, but soon he'll be drinking blood. And then everyone in the bar says, "Down with the state" or something, and Stirner says, "Down with law also." And they do have this kind of a semi. I mean, we don't know much about it, to be honest, the relationship between the two of them. Engels does write to Stirner, saying that this is actually quite good. I mean, we are communists out of egoism also. That's what he says to Marx. And then I think Carl, that bitch, comes in and she splits our two beautiful boys apart. But also this time, Engels has moved out of Berlin at this point, really. They've just moved. I mean, Stirner is probably in debtor's prison at the point it's coming out. I mean, Stirner doesn't have a good life, not in the slightest. By the time the German ideology comes out, I mean, Stirner wouldn't have been in a position to write anything back, and he wouldn't have seen it in the first place. I mean, but this relationship between Stirner and Marx seems to persevere even beyond the German ideology, because in Capital Volume 1, there's a little section where Marx is talking about how capital sometimes it sets up its own rules, its own morality of competition and exchange. And occasionally it needs to break its own rules because it suddenly realizes it's limiting itself. And so how does it do that? One of the reasons it does that is one of the ways in which it breaks its own rules is by invoking this nihilistic figure of the bourgeois individualist. Marx calls them this Sancho Panza who comes in, shows how all the rules are worth breaking, and then capital can reconfigure its own morality and keep going. And this term Sancho Panza is a reference to Cervantes' Don Quixote, but it's one of the names that Stirner is given in the German ideology. So there's definitely a sense in which this sort of Stirnerian figure, this nihilistic figure who Marx is worried about as just being an unwilling servant of capital, sort of coming in and living sort of rent-free in Marx's head for quite a few years. And I think is there a question, does Stirner unwittingly serve capital? I mean, nihilism can definitely do so. Nihilism could definitely be an excuse to say anything goes and reconfigure itself. But at the same time, given Stirner's abject hatred for capitalist property rights and capitalist competition, which says it's not really competition, is it? Because I can't steal your stuff and use it to compete in the same market. So it's hardly competition. It's really the worship of property. I would think Stirner goes beyond that a bit, but of course, there's always going to be nihilists who serve capital. I mean, Elon Musk is a good example of this, I guess. Very right nihilistic fan base. The Rick and Morty verse. That's a great show. Just I wouldn't, but you can definitely see that sort of alignment there. Or the nihilistic side of Thatcherism, where we have to destroy it, really open things up because the money's booming.
Right. So you mentioned like a bit of like a metaphysical insurrection, and I'm wondering, like, I didn't get a chance to read like all of Stirner's work, obviously, but like, is there any point within the work of Stirner that he goes towards an unabstract insurrectionary, or is it just like straight up like talking about undermining sort of spooks and other conventional notions and stuff like that?
In terms of positive program, he's responding to other people. It's not much of a positive program there. So there are sections which he criticises social liberalism, which is what he called socialism of his day. It wasn't Marxian at the time, which is the idea that the people become this new kind of God. The liberals who make the rational this new kind of principle. The humane liberals who make humanity an end in itself. I mean, by this point, the religious stuff is a great as an example, but for Stirner, it's already sort of gone by anyway. And positive programs? No, he doesn't have a program. You might as well to quote Kuhnberg, this is not a program. I think it's fundamentally a kind of a manual for reorienting yourself to the concepts of what it means to be what it means to have property, what it means to own things, what it means to own yourself, and what it means to do something out of respect. What does it mean to treat something as sacred? Because spooks are treated as sacred because they are things that cannot be trespassed, cannot be transgressed, and they must be obeyed to on their own terms. And I think fundamentally, it's a manual of self-reorientation constructed at a certain time for a certain audience. And also, I think that my work is to dig up, using contemporary tools of Hegel scholarship, a lot of the underlying metaphysics and a lot of the ways of constructing what he would have been doing, especially given his intellectual lineage, not only from Hegelianism and people like Karl Werder and stuff like that, but also responding to people like Feuerbach. So in the beginning, when Stirner says that God is an egoist, that's a Feuerbachian thesis, and where you get this idea of Stirner being Hegelian, it comes from, even though he's very critical of Hegel in the book, it mainly comes from a review that Stirner did of a book called The Trumpet of the Last Judgment Against Hegel, the Atheist and Antichrist, by a guy called Bruno Bauer, who's most known for writing on the Jewish question, which Marx responds to, where Bauer says, this Hegel system will, quote unquote, blow the Christian state sky high. So there's already a sense this time that Hegel, despite the fact he was had this very conservative element, had this element of this system is actually, by explaining everything, really, it's kind of undermined the basis for everything by showing us how it really works. And if we know how the machine works, we can maybe grab hold of the levers and do some fucking damage to the bastards,
Right. Yeah, man. Wow. So I guess as one final question, I want to ask you, because it's an interesting path you took to arrive at Stirner through like Hegelian studies and stuff. And I think this would be a much more complicated question if I asked you it in reference to Hegelianism broadly. But in terms of just like Max Stirner and his work, I'm wondering if there are any sort of practical takeaways that have enhanced your life through reading Stirner, either like a reorientation of the self, or is there like is there an empowerment through like the egoism that Stirner presents that allows you to maybe be more self-referential, I just wonder if like, for people living in 2021, if they pick up, the ego on its own and they start to read that, do you think there's like a philosophical benefit one might get from reading that work?
I think there is, but I have to admit, even in my own work, I would like to sort of add like my own work as a bit of a filter in through that, because I have seen some horrific things come out of the reading of Max Stirner. I mean, there's loads of commentaries up on the site, and when the thesis is finished, there's going to be a lot of extra stuff coming out on that about the idea of Stirner as an ethical thinker, not as a thinker, but a lot of people read him, especially when it comes to the translation where the unique, the Einzige, is the ego, and they come away with this idea that everything is my property, I can treat everyone how I like, and they get addicted to this spectre of egoism, which makes them think that they're in some sort of higher ontological register than everyone else. It's almost like what happens with people with Nietzsche and Übermensch. And I think,
right. Yeah, it seems.
So,
like,
what I've got from Stirner is a sense of the autonomy of one is linked to the autonomy of all, because everyone, my autonomy. If there's not this space of mutuality, we're all being held in common by the same power structures, and I can't have such a fixed idea of myself, a spook of myself, to think that any any persecution of someone else couldn't be applied to me, as if myself isn't so malleable it could take upon its properties as well. If you allow these powers to attack the most vulnerable, the most marginalized people, myself can be reconfigured in many ways. It can also be used upon me, and if you don't let it, if you don't stop it, it will. I think fundamentally a sense of mutual autonomy, mutual sympathy, because the self isn't as rigid as Stirner or Stirner's receptions made it show. The self is very malleable, very plastic, willing to take on board things that it doesn't know it can do until it does. That's very Spinoza's point. We do not know what a self can do.
Right.
I think fundamentally there's more ethical reorientation to the autonomy of one being the autonomy of all there. And also the idea that we shouldn't subsume the people who we are close to, or people in general, under fixed conceptions of them. Presuppositions, prejudices, essences. We should have an inherent sort of disposition to seeing the capacities of becoming different, becoming other. And this is also, I think, there's also a possible reconciliation between people like Deleuze and people like Hegel around this figure, who both will have honestly reviled. I mean, Hegel would have reviled what Stirner did, most likely. And Deleuze definitely did. So I think so. Mutuality, comradeship, the interlinking of all autonomy, and also don't do revolution because because you have a God-given command from history to do so. Do it for you, and do it for everyone else. If you're doing it from you, and you've got the right conception of what you is, the malleability, the plasticity, what autonomy is for you, then you could do it for. Then you do it for everyone else.
It's really interesting, because what I'm picking up on here is that, and I don't think I'm wrong in this, but like I think that you could come away with a really horrific interpretation of Stirner.
Many have.
And many have, right? And I think, many have come away with a reading of Nietzsche in a awful sort of sense as well. But when you start telling me about how, the autonomy of one is the autonomy of all, the union of egoists, and it sounds like some liberation theology stuff of my freedom is wrapped up in your freedom, and your limits are my limits, and my freedom only extends as far as your freedom, So, but those ideas, they come from elsewhere. They don't come from Stirner himself, And so, I wonder if these ideas existing within your outlook on things permits you to come away with a reading of Stirner that is much more liberation-minded than perhaps Stirner himself in his writing, would have
that's entirely
intended.
possible. I mean, he wasn't. We don't have much record of Stirner's own praxis, apart from the anarchist milk shop that tried to eliminate the capitalist middleman and try to get people to get it directly from them. So purely a mutual benefit for the people selling it, to a mutual benefit for people coming out of it, and that's the limits of praxis. No, but I think fundamentally, one sort of the aspect of sympathy in Stirner, which is really heavily laid on. I think you get a lot of it from that. Two, the definition of a spook really can't let one become, because the spook is also a manner of addiction in a way. One can become addicted to one's representations, one's fixed ideas. And I think to be addicted to power, he thanks his education because it says it puts a little bit of a stopgap between his desires and his fundamental subjectivity. Because if a desire takes hold upon you, it becomes a spook. It becomes something you serve at a higher ontological register than the self, which is ultimately a kind of creative split, creative nothingness. And fundamentally, I think this commits Stirner to a non-domination view of ethics and subjective practice. Even though he does it is most explicit, he does sound very dominatory. There's been some amazing work done on this. So in 2015, there was a collection, the first edited collection of essays on Stirner in English, called Max Stirner, but edited by Saul Newman. And Newman, and I disagree with overly post-structuralist reading of Stirner quite a bit, has this beautiful essay, though, called Max Stirner, Foucault, and the Ethics of Involuntary Servitude. And he tries to create this ethos of non-domination. And I think domination is fundamentally something that Stirner couldn't agree with, based on his own education itself, because the structure of domination, as he would have learned from Hegel, is the master-slave dialectic, where one side is given sort of ontological independence and authority, and the other one isn't. But the authority actually relies upon the one who doesn't have any authority to recognise the authority according to their will. So he would have known that the structure of domination is ultimately self-defeating. And I think you can definitely extract. I mean, I think you definitely can get this from there. I mean, liberation theology.
Okay.
I think liberation theology aspect you could also extract out of Hegel. Hegel's theology and the idea of the, especially getting like Hegel as well, the idea that God also essentially supersedes his own position, gives his position to us in religion, sort of dies on the cross and inaugurates the community of believers as the real living body of God there. And in that sense, all God is the interpersonal recognition and practice of one to another. So liberation theology in Hegel, I think you could definitely get it from there. And especially given the sort of the liberation, because he was building on Feuerbach. Feuerbach was giving a kind of liberation theology. The book he was responding to was called The Essence of Christianity, which is about how God is really just man's own self-feeling. And we need to have a revolutionary reconception of society based on, actually, God is just our own essence, looking back upon us from a distance. And Stirner's reply is, yes, but by your own logic, this is just the same alienation happening again because you've made the essence of man God. And this is where we establish Stirner. So I don't think these things are necessarily... I mean, there's definitely some stuff brought from the outside. The tools of Hegel's scholarship, I'm bringing in people like Zizek, Malabou, McGowan, 100%, yeah. I mean, you're not going to get Malabou without Derrida and Heidegger and loads of readings threading through that. You're not going to get McGowan without Lacan and the same with Zizek, but you can use the tools of contemporary Hegel scholarship to go back and correct some of, try to examine what these guys were seeing in Hegel that was so revolutionary. And what was so dangerous that Hegel himself didn't even know it. This can blow the Christian state sky high. The man who wrote the philosophy of right. Then she obviously translates, the state is the march of God on earth. That's a bad translation, but that's what everyone says about Hegel. And wow. I think there's this raw, underlying sort of insurrectionary kind of power, I think. I don't think you can get that from Stirner. You just need to know where to look.
Yeah, it seems like you said something earlier that really encapsulated it, but I think it kind of touches on what Will was talking about with his stuff, with like a revolutionary metaphysical gambit.
Absolutely.
In that, like, it's kind of undermining the very foundations of thought itself. Stirner seems to be sort of reorienting the individual to itself, but there's stuff inside there that, like, I came into this interview, I will tell you, I came into this interview a little reluctant on, like, thinking it would be like this hardcore individualist stuff, but there's also, it's really cool that we've had this conversation, as I see that there are aspects of the collective within this work that I don't know that I was entirely, I didn't even notice that stuff beforehand. So it's really cool that you've kind of shined some light on that, and it's not quite so like a I don't know. I guess I kind of thought of Stirner and his philosophy would be more like a Victorian Anton LaVey or something.
Yeah. I know. There hasn't been a full. I mean, there has been some amazing work done by, for example, Lawrence Sapelevich, on linking Hegel and Stirner. Okay. But in terms of the logic and metaphysics, there's not really been a study of Hegel and Stirner ever really done. I mean, some people do it a bit. Some people like Spinoza. Yeah. Some people try and do. They mentioned Hegel. It's never really. So I'm trying to bring out this hidden depths of Stirner, and I think going to have a collectivism out of Stirner, but a collectivism without a capital C collective, because he's talking to these people who are trying to build these new collectivities, and they lose themselves in it completely. They're like good writers, they're sort of completely servile to their work. And Stirner just puts this little stopgap here and saying, Deleuze actually says it very well. He says, Feuerbach talks about the divine man. What is man? Man is the divine alienated from itself. And then Stirner shows up and says, okay, who is man? He's not me. I mean, like, I'm kind of just swapping out one boss for another here. And there's the same structural implications. I mean, I think looking past a moment where he reinserts the individual as a real factor can also show the ways in which it can integrate itself within a wider collectivity that doesn't sort of reify itself, to use the sort of the Marxist Lukácsian term, into a new domination.
Yeah, I think ultimately, maybe that's what we're trying to take out of this, right? Or that's what Stirner's trying to communicate is like, yeah, do what you want, but like, just don't kind of reconstitute domination in alternative framings,
Absolutely.
And maybe that's the most practical takeaway out of this stuff. And again, it goes back to that quote earlier by Matty Thomas, like, these spooks can be even more vicious than more visible forms of authority. So that's really cool, and you've given me a different way to look at Stirner at this point. I'm not quite so opposed to the guy at this point, and it's given me some stuff to chew on. So that's really cool, Adam. I appreciate it, man.
People always think Stirner's a "don't tread on me" guy, but really he's like, well, even if you don't tread on me, you're still treading on yourself for believing in that bullshit. I mean.
Right, he kind of he seems like he's urging us to sort of cut through the bullshit, like to get past, like treading on yourself, to ultimately like get clear about like who you are, what your position is, where are the forces that like what kind of cop in your head is ruling you, kind
absolutely.
of thing, Very cool. Well, Adam Jones is a co-host on the Acid Horizon podcast. Adam, how do they find you on Twitter?
You can find me at SanktMaxTCI, so that's capital S, capital M Max, and then TCI all free. Or just go onto the Acid Horizon page. There's always a pinned tweet with our stuff on it. Go find Matt, go find Will, go find Craig, who's the Acid Horizon official guy. I do some blog. You can find my Twitter page. I do some blog posts, articles. There's a summary of my work on Stirner. There's commentaries on Stirner. There's some place we can find some resources, all at happyhour@hipples.wordpress.com. And if you like a mixture of jungle, power electronics, shouty things, which are definitely too loud for most headphones, then you can go to thecominginsurrection.bandcamp.com.